Oop, let me go back. So what I want to talk about, there's been a lot of people talking about this, and a lot of discussions on the Israel, the land. Um, Mostly for all of us, but mostly for the young kids, because Blake was talking about how even in school they're teaching that Israel's an occupier and it's Palestinian land and Palestinian state. And some of his friends were even like, how could you think that's Israel's land? They are occupiers or taking over the Palestinian land. And so it seems to be something that's even being taught mainstream, much less we see all the the riots and the picketing throughout the world. So I thought it'd be good just to review it yet again. So I wanted to go through just the history of the land. I know there's been some good talks. Aunt Bonnie even did a young kids study on this, but it's good to go through kind of the history of what is the Palestinians, what's the Palestinian state, who's been in the land of Israel from the beginning of time till now, just so we have a good grasp on this. So when we're talking about this, or like when our kids are talking about this to friends in school, or even to their teachers, they have some good, reliable, objective data they can give them. See, even if they don't want to take the biblical approach, there's a lot of historical, archaeological findings that kind of support this land. So I want to review that again. This okay. So what we're going to look at is historical review of Israel from biblical times till today, and then a lot of this Palestine, the Palestinian state, all that kind of where do those terms come from? Are they biblical? What is it really referring to? So let me move this out of the way there so I can see my own thing. So this is just a general map I took off the World Population Review. So when we look, everything in green here is primarily a Muslim Arab countries. They're Islam is a religion, so they're Muslim countries. And then that little bitty red thing is Israel, the home for the Jews. So we have over 2 billion Muslims that are worldwide, and there's a large concentration of them in these green areas. And then there's less than 16 million Jews worldwide, less than 10 million in Israel. And this is the land for Israel, and yet this is such a big issue. How dare them take this little red slit of land when all these primarily Muslim countries are surrounding them? But it's not just that. Even within the country of Israel, there's disputed areas and there's disputed land. So if we look at the general population of Israel, there's about 9.5 million as of earlier this year. Most are Jews, about 71% are Jews. But the second biggest group are Muslims. So these are actually Muslims living in Israel. They're part of the Israeli society. They serve in the IDF. They're lawyers. There's doctors. So these are people that have kind of integrated into society. And then we have some of the other religions are a minority. We hear this all the time. And this seems to be everywhere. So even within that little red slit, which is Israel, we have these areas now that are sort of UN defines them as a single entity of occupied territory. So Gaza and the West Bank are pretty much locked off for these Palestinian Arabs. So even within that little area, the Jewish Israelites don't control the whole thing. We have these other areas. Now, some people call this a Palestinian state. As I said, the UN defines this as a single entity in occupied territory, and which we'll talk about later, especially since 2005 when they gave them this territory, they still didn't have enough to qualify as a state for the UN. They have to have secure borders, they have to have government, there's all these things that qualify you, and they didn't. So they're considered to be an occupied territory, and they're a non-member observer state in the UN since 2012. So why is it that even though a large majority of these 2 billion Muslims control most of the Middle East and Northern Africa, they still aren't happy with the Jews taking over that little bitty piece of land in there? So that's what we want to talk about. So first, let's get into the word Palestine. So Palestine is rarely used in the Old Testament, as we'll find out. It's only used 8 times. And when it is, it always refers to the southwestern coastal area of Israel that was occupied by the Philistines. And so we'll show a bunch of maps. And a lot of the maps, there's always this little area where present day Gaza is, where the Philistines lived at the time. So this Palestine is a translation of the Hebrew word Pelesheth. So in the Bible, it's never used to refer to the whole land of Israel. It's only used to refer to that small area, kind of the Gaza-like area where the Philistine people lived. And it's never used in the New Testament. So I just put up 2 maps here. The left one is the 12 tribes of Israel, and on the right one, we've already got the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah and all the other kind of kingdoms around there. And in both of these, we have this Philistia, we have this Philistine city states. So we have these areas where the Philistines and different people have lived, and that's what the Bible's referring to. So when we talk about that, it's never the whole area. It's not the area that God promised Abraham in the Bible. It's always this specific area. And so I put the 8 verses up here. I'm not going to read through them, but we got Exodus, Psalms, Isaiah, and Joel. And most of the times it's a warning. It's a warning to these people here. Um, but again, it's only referring to that specific area of the Philistines. And so never the whole area of Israel within the Bible. So that's kind of the biblical aspect of this Palestinian or Palestine. Move out of here. So when we look at the history of this, the first time that Palestine is really talked about and written down is with the Greek, because the Greek historians talk about everything. They talk about the Persians. Most of our information comes from the Greek historians. We've talked a lot on previous ones about Herodotus, and he's considered to be the father of lies. He's the guy that says, listen, whether it's true or not, I don't know. My job is to write down history. So that's kind of where we're starting. But Herodotus is the one that's kind of referred to when we first think about using Palestine, referring to the whole area. So the earliest written record referring to Palestine that we can find is from the Histories of Herodotus from the 5th century, and he defines the area of the district of Syria called Palestina between Phoenicia and Egypt. So he's the one that kind of gives the whole land this name. And so the map on the left is the world according to Herodotus. He's got his own map. And then I just kind of zoomed in on the right side, and as you can see there, you've got Euphrates and Assyria, you've got Syria, and then Palestina or Palestine is what he's referring to as that whole area. But that's just Herodotus. When we look at even Josephus, Josephus usually used like Judea. Sometimes he does use Palestine, but it wasn't commonly used with that terminology. But of course, Josephus comes much later. So even though we have these records of some of these Greek historians using Palestine or Palestine, referring to the area, they refer to everybody living there. It's not a people, it's just an area. So whether you're Muslim or you're Jewish, you live in the area of Palestine. But what's interesting about that, there's no evidence of the name on any coin or any inscription or any official document before you get to the Roman Empire. So even though you've got some historians talking about it and describing the area as this, other ones are using different names, and there's no official recognition of this until we get to the Roman era. So before 135 AD, so we're skipping ahead a bit here, the Romans used the term Judea and Galilee to refer to the land of Israel, and that's the most common form. They use that on all their official documents. So even when Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Roman government struck a coin with the phrase Judea capta, which meaning they've captured Judea. The word Palestine, again, was never officially used, and this is a copy of the coin there that says Judea capta. So that was kind of the common terminology there. But then we get to this last Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba, I think that was the guy's last name, against Rome in 135. That was against Emperor Hadrian. Emperor Hadrian is the one that really put this term Palestine to the land of Israel. So a lot of people credit calling that whole land of Israel Palestine to Emperor Hadrian at 135 AD. So he took the ancient names of the Israel enemies, the Philistines, which the Bible was talking about that particular land only. He Latinized it to Palestine and he applied it to the entire land of Israel. And what they say in a lot of these historians that he wanted to erase Israel from all memory. He wanted to give the name of their enemies to that, so he called Palestine. And what we'll talk about in a bit, he also changed the name of Jerusalem. Not only did he change the name of the land of Israel, but also the land of Jerusalem, just to try to kind of get rid of any Jewish presence there. So then we move on a little bit. We got Eusebius, which is the 4th century Roman historian, and he didn't accept Hadrian's designation. Hadrian wanted to call Jerusalem Aelia Capitaliana. I think that's how you say it. But he didn't really go with that. He still said, well, Jerusalem's a better one to use, but he did use Hadrian's term Palestine. So once he started using Palestine, he called himself a bishop of Palestine. It really started taking off. So it started with Emperor Hadrian, but then when you get some of these historians starting to pick it up and use it, from this point on, it's really kind of the common term that's being used. The land itself, Palestine. But it wasn't for the people. It was just that this is the land of Palestine. Or they called it Judea, or they call it Canaan. It was these different names, but really from Hadrian, and then you get some of these Roman historians. That's where it took off, and there's almost all the writings and the maps. They call it the land of Palestine or Syria Palestine. So when the British received the mandate after World War One, so I'm kind of skipping ahead here too, they called the land on both sides of the Jordan River Palestine because by this time it was pretty commonly used. And this became sort of what they used all the time. They didn't care who lived there. And even on this map, I thought it was funny because this says Palestine at the time of Jesus. Well, nobody would have called it Palestine at the time of Jesus, really. I mean, maybe Herodotus and some of those, but that's not necessarily what they would have even called the land. But even when they go back now on these maps, everything's Palestine, everything's Palestine. So it doesn't really matter a whole lot what we call it, except for this is being used for a certain group of people. So it's good to know the history of this. If somebody asks, I'll be like, 135 Hadrian. That was the first time this was commonly used, and it was an insult to the Jews. It was naming them after the Philistines. But if we look at the Bible, it only refers to that specific area of land, never the whole land of Israel. So let's look at kind of the historical record of this. I'll try to slow down. I know I talk fast. So I've used this before. This is just that general Genesis timeline from Adam to Abraham. Whether this is accurate or not, I don't know, but I kind of like it. It looks like we have about 1,000 years from Adam to Noah, and maybe about 1,000 years from Noah to Abraham. So generally, as far as the dates, if we try to use a lot of the dates given in Genesis and Exodus, whether it's correct or not, I don't know. But what I want to start with is after Noah, when he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth, because that's where kind of the peoples of the world divide out. And so this is one of the maps. There's many of these maps going from some of the biblical texts of where Shem, Ham, and Japheth kind of divide up. So Ham kind of goes down into Africa. He kind of comes up originally and takes the land of Canaan. Shem goes more into the Middle East and a little bit of Asia. And then Japheth goes a little bit of Asia, but up into Europe, the European nations. So they kind of divide up in these different areas. And then they set up tribes and cities and kind of starts to get some intermingling when we get to this the land of Canaan, which we're going to call it originally, this Israel land. So if we assume, well, we don't worry about the dates right now. But we only go 50 to 100 years later, and we have what most people consider the first great empire is the Akkadian Empire. And the Akkadian Empire started by the great grandson of Noah. So if we got Noah, who had Ham, who had Cush, who had Nimrod, most archaeologists and historians say Nimrod is the same as Sargon. And Sargon is supposed to be the first king of the Akkadian Empire. And that was one of the first major empires, a lot of archaeological evidence kind of talking about Akkadian Empire. And if we go back to Genesis 10, we can read about this a little bit. And Cush began Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. And he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And so we kind of know where the land of Shinar is. It's all this kind of fertile valley with the kind of starting a little bit in what we consider the land of Israel, but kind of going through the Tigris and Euphrates and all that Middle Eastern region. So this might be 100 years or so after the flood, plus or minus. We don't really know, but it wasn't more than a few hundred years, and we already have these major kingdoms being set up, and we have um, some Shem and some Ham descendants sort of taking over this land of Canaan, which is called at the time. And so, why is it called Canaan? Well, we can look back at the Canaanite period. Now, the historians say the Canaanite period is from like 3,300 to 1,000 BC, and I put 3,300 in like quotations there on italics because I'm not sure if that really predates the flood even. But however you look at it, it's kind of the first people in this area they consider to be the Canaanites, and of course that's named after Canaan. So if we review that from Genesis 9:20, and these I put up on the screen. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and was uncovered with his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. And we kind of, Mom's even talked about a really good article about what the nakedness of his father really meant. It probably was his wife. But if we go down to verse 25, and cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren, and blessed be the Lord God of Shem. So, of course, the blessings are going to come through Shem. And so Canaanites are generally considered to be named from the descendants of Canaan. And so some of the I put some archaeological videos here, then I skipped over them because they're not that exciting. But there's tons and tons of evidence showing there was these nomadic kind of tribal Canaanites that lived in this land first. So the oldest post-flood people they considered to be the Canaanites. So it was called the land of Canaan. And the oldest scripts mentioned of the land of Israel were not found in that region, though, but it was found kind of throughout that fertile valley and down in Egypt. So they say the Canaanites were not one nation, but different people who lived and they paid taxes and tributes to either the rulers up in this fertile valley or the rulers down in Egypt. But those were kind of the Canaanites, so this land was called Canaan at the time. So we're not too far post flood. Then we skip ahead a couple hundred more years. Then we get the time of Abraham. So at the time of Abraham, he lived in the city of Ur, which is in green. And as we talked about before, Ur was probably the biggest city in the world at the time on population. It was quite advanced as far as um, astronomy and mathematics. And of course, God tells him to move to this land of Canaan. I'm going to give you this land. And so he works his way up to Haran and then down to this Canaan, which we have these Canaanite tribes, which are pretty ungodly pagan tribes. So different names have been given for the land. It's been called Canaan, the Promised Land, the Holy Land. With Moses, it's called the land of milk and honey, the land of Israel. A lot of times we'll just use Judea or Judea, referring to the whole land, not just with the southern kingdom. And then, of course, we got Palestine, which really comes after the Roman Empire. And so this map just kind of shows the different journeys between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob living in and kind of occupying this land of Canaan at the time, which would be present day Israel. So we have promises made. So not only are they living there, they're promised this land, starting in Abraham. So I thought it'd be good to kind of review some of these promises. And so we'll just go, these are in multiple areas, but the first promises of the land and the seed made to Abraham is in Genesis chapter 17. I'll just read verses 4 through 9. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of these, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee and thy generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God to thee and a seed to thee. And I will give unto thee, thou art seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So here he's not only making him and his seed, possessor of the land forever, he actually tells him the land, and there's even gives borders of where this land is. So this land has been promised to Abraham and the seed of Abraham. And then Abraham has Ishmael, and then God lets him know when he's old and Sarah's old that actually the promise isn't going to go through Ishmael, it's going to go through Isaac. So you're going to have Isaac as an old man, and Sarah's going to be an old woman. And so I think when Isaac's about 13, Ishmael lives off in the wilderness with Hagar. So the promises that start with Abraham are now going to Isaac. So if you look at Genesis 17, verses 18 through 20, and Abraham said to thee, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And then, of course, he said, I heard Ishmael, and I will still, make him a mighty prince. And but the promise of this land, the specific land, is now gone to Isaac. And then, of course, as we know, if we move on to Genesis chapter 35, when you do it on the phone, it's easier just to, there we go. Okay, so Genesis chapter 35, verses 9 through 12. And God appeared to Jacob again when he came out of Pandamaram and blessed him. And God said to him, thou name is Jacob, thou shalt not be called anymore Jacob, but Israel shall be thy name. And he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am a God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. And the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed after thee shall I give the land. And of course, Jacob got the blessing from his father. Plus, he got the blessing from God. Plus, he wrestled the angel. So he had kind of multiple steps of blessings. But again, it went through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not to Ishmael. Ishmael, as Josephus says, is the founder of the Arabs, the Arab people. And of course, Esau married Ishmael's daughter or granddaughter. I mean, I can't remember, but so we kind of have that Arab population starting off there. And then, of course, we know that there's a famine and they get pushed out into Egypt. So then we're told, well, God will bring them back into the land. So if we go back to Genesis 15, I mean, so there's quite a bit of God's promises to these people, to this land. So Genesis chapter 15, verses 14 through 16. And also the nation with whom shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go into thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of Amorites is not yet full. So this is in the saying that you're going to leave, but in the fourth generation we are going to bring you back. You will be back into this land. And then of course we have where Moses is talked, and we'll just read one of these. I think we're all pretty familiar with this, but it's always good to review. So if we go through Exodus 3, verse 8, and so this is Moses, and I come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up into that land, into a good land, and a large, into a land flowing with milk and honey, and to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So again, it's prophesied that he's going to bring them back, and Moses is the one that brings them back. And then, of course, the Jews get scattered throughout until they're brought back again in 1948. So, I mean, it's kind of a quick review, but it's definitely through these people that these promises in this land is made. Well, on the top there, I've got the long and short sojourn. Like, how long were they in Egypt? And there's two different thoughts. One would be the long sojourn because it says 430 years. The other one would be a short sojourn that, well, if we add up the actual dates, it only seems like they were actually in Egypt for 215 years or so. So maybe the 430-year prophecy is when Abram enters Canaan. This really has nothing to do with the talk. I just added in because I thought it was really interesting. This 430-year sojourn, if we say they were in Egypt for 430 years, there's a lot of genealogy that's kind of left out that we wouldn't know, would have to fill in. But if we follow the genealogy through the Bible, then the 430 years would have to start where Abram comes into Canaan. Doesn't really matter. The promises are still through them, and they are prophesied they will come back out of Egypt into the same land. I just thought that was interesting, so I thought I'd throw it in. Probably make a good study on itself. All right, so we have some of these dates. Abraham is the father of many nations. Everybody says he's the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But the promises, as we just read, were made specifically through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and reiterated to his people through Moses. And so these are just some dates. You can take them or leave them. As far as Abraham and Sarah go to Canaan, and then Jacob and his family leave for Egypt. And so they're there a couple hundred years. And then we have this 430 or 400 years they're in Egypt, however you want to take that. And then they come back into the land. And now they're back into the land for quite a long time. So even though they're gone in Egypt for the famine, they were there for a while and now they're back for a while. So this is just a confusing chart on the judges. But on the left side, it kind of shows Moses and there's Joshua. And then here's all those judges which we recently studied. And of course, during the judges, they are in the land of Canaan. And then we have, so here's kind of this judges. So this is God's people controlling that land. Of course, you can see the enemies all around there, the Philistines, the Amalekites, the Jebusites. But we still have them in this land of Canaan for quite a long time. And then, of course, they demand a king. So we have this kingdom of Saul, David, and Solomon. And this is a nice map because it kind of shows how it got expanded and even expanded more under Solomon. And so we have this united kingdom through the promises. So, I mean, these are hundreds and hundreds of years that they're in the land of Canaan, or if you want to call it the land of Israel after Jacob. But they're in this land, they control this land. Of course, they have their enemies around, they didn't destroy them all, but they still controlled this land. And then, of course, we know about the split. So the northern tribes refused to accept Solomon's successor, which is Rehoboam. So now we have the split, but they're still controlling the land. They're just splitting it. So we have Israel in the north. We have Judah at the south with Jerusalem. And of course, here's all those enemy states around there. And there's the Philistine city states. But they still were in control of the majority of this land. Not all of it, but the majority of the land. I meant to put a map in here of the actual promises God made to Abraham, where from this river to this. I can't remember them exactly, but it's a significant amount of land, more than they ever got because they didn't do what he instructed them to. But I mean, I think it takes up most of Syria and Jordan and down into Egypt. I mean, God promised them quite a large tract of land, which they never took. But nonetheless, they're still in control. And I won't bore you with videos, but there's tons of archaeological evidence of the kings of Israel and Judah. I mean, a lot. That kind of proves they were there. It proves what they did, what they controlled, some of their different accounting and taxations they've got. And so this is from the Armstrong Institute. Below are biblical kings of Israel and Judah whose existence have been independently confirmed by archaeology. The kings documented from the last 2 centuries across the Middle East. Most of these can be confirmed by multiple artifacts. And some of the previous ones I added these in because I think they're interesting. But people that don't believe the Bible, I'm like, well, if you believe archaeology or history, I mean, it's right there. So I'm not sure how you can dispute this. So this is pretty firm, even if you're not a Bible believer. Okay, so then let's move along. So now we've got the Assyrians take over the Northern Empire because they didn't have a whole lot of, or I think they had zero good kings. And so the Assyrians take over Israel, the Northern Kingdom, in 722. But we still have the Kingdom of Judah. And then we move to 586, about 150 years later. And finally, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon takes over Judah. And so now we're starting to disperse the Jews or God's promised people from this Canaan land or the land of Israel. So Jerusalem is destroyed. The people are pulled away. Of course, there's always some Jews that remain in the land throughout time, but most of them are pulled away into Babylon. And then we have the, well, I guess I'll read that. Then we have Jeremiah's talking about how they're going to be exiled for 70 years. So finally, we've got the Israel and Judah is taken away. We've got King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. The first gold head empire is in there. So let me read Jeremiah 29:1. If I can't find it on my phone, that's really bad. Okay. And now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem and to the residue of the elders which were carried away captives, and to the priests and to the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. Well, that's not it. Well, somewhere in here it talks about the 70 years, and then you shall return. Well, I won't waste a lot of time going to that, but it's here. I promise. I'll find it later. But so Jeremiah talks about this 70 years. And then what happens? So here we've got kind of Nebuchadnezzar's image that Daniel talks about, where we kind of know what's coming because we have the Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian, Greek, Roman, and then the end times, there's still quite a bit going on, but they're not as strong and big of empires. But about 70 years later, the Babylonian Empire falls to the Medo-Persian Empire, and we got Cyrus. So, plus or minus around 70 years, Cyrus allows the exiled Jews to return. So they're gone for 70 years. There's a few that remain, but 70 years later, Cyrus allows them to return. Zerubbabel starts leading people in. They rebuild the temple. Ezra starts bringing people in. Nehemiah goes in and rebuilds the Jerusalem's walls and gates. So we kind of have this restoration, the second temple, the wall, all this happening under Cyrus. He was, pro-Jewish. Then Alexander the Great. So, the greatest empire of all. He didn't last very long, but the Persian period ended when Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East. So now we're working our way down Daniel's image. The interesting thing about Alexander the Great is he paid honor to the Jewish people and the high priest. He let them continue their customs. Of course, they had to install a tax system to pay him. I mean, he wasn't that great. He made sacrifices at the temple, so they say. And so he was also relatively pro-Jewish. He didn't really upset their traditions. And so he let them continue off. Even though he controlled the world, he let them kind of continue some of their traditions in this land of Israel, Canaan. And then he dies shortly after, and we have some of his generals taken over, the Ptolemies and Seleucids. And it kind of goes back and forth. So this is kind of a rougher time. They're fighting right where the land happens to be, where the land of Israel is. So this goes good and bad, back and forth between the two for the Jews until King Antiochus Epiphanes. So when he comes in, he's pretty much done with the Jews. He's not really, too impressed with them. He wants to get them out, kill them. And all this we consider to be the silent years of the Bible because this is after the Old Testament and before the New Testament. But how do we know about this? Well, we know about this because Daniel actually prophesies about a lot of this time. We have Josephus, the historian, who talks about it. And then if you take the book of the Maccabees, maybe just as more history, if anything else, it kind of talks about this stuff. So, because of Antiochus Epiphanes, we've got the Maccabean revolution against the Seleucids. So, the Seleucids are the ones that controlled it towards the end when it went back and forth between the Ptolemies and Seleucids. And so, at this time, Judah Maccabee captures Jerusalem, and we have what they call a smaller Jewish kingdoms restored in the land. So, we still have Jews there. We still have a pretty, what they call a small Jewish kingdom, but we've got all these Jewish, whatever you want to call them, Jewish heroes kind of controlling and taking over different parts of the land, still dominating this area. And this is considered the Hasmonean period of history. So, quite a bit of this time, either nobody's really in control or famine, or the Jews are in control, even though somebody else might be, in control of the whole area that they pay taxes to. Then we get to the Roman period. So now we're down through the legs. And so this is Christ's time, basically. The Roman general Pompey captures Jerusalem, and I just put some important dates on these. Herod conquers Jerusalem from the Hasmoneans, so now they're kind of done. He expands the second temple. We have Christ, and Christ is executed during this time of the Roman Empire. But this is a little bit later, about 100 years later. This is where we get Emperor Hadrian. He wasn't messing around. He changed the name of Judea to Syria Palestina or Palestine. He changed the name of Jerusalem to Alia Capitolina, which I've never really heard that, but supposedly that's what he insisted. He bans Jews from the city. He wants to destroy any thought of Jews or Judea or Jewish life, which is very similar to what some of the Palestinian Arabs kind of have, or the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of their creeds are very similar to what Emperor Hadrian wanted to do to the Jews. Then we move into the second part, the Eastern Roman Empire, which is the Byzantine period. Like they say, most of the people living there didn't even realize there was a transition because it was pretty smooth for them. But this is the name given to the mark of Christianity. So this is when Christianity really started up hard. This is where Constantine renames the city Jerusalem. So it's definitely Jerusalem. They got rid of that other name. What was that name? Alia Capitolina. Everybody liked Jerusalem, but they were okay saying Palestine's a good name for this group. And then Christianity is declared the official religion of the Roman Empire, and Jews are kind of banned. So from this point on, the Jews are kind of getting pushed out and being banned. Not as good for them as it has been in previous times. So now we'll get into a couple other periods. Now Islam starts. Now we've got the Arab Caliphate, and we have Muhammad, and he takes his journey. And so Islam, depending on what date you want to use, starts between 610 and 632. So this is the Islam, this is the Arabs' land, this is the Muslim Palestinians' land. We've gone through quite a bit of history already. Quite a bit of history. Not only the promises, but just archaeologically who was living there before this even starts. So the people that argue this really anger me, like they don't understand anything about the history if they're just looking at peoples, not even religion. Or religion. So anyway, so the Arab Caliphate is where you got Muhammad, you got the Dome of the Rock, the mosque. All this is built kind of within this period between 600 and 1000. Muhammad is born. Islam is started as the major religion kind of in the Middle East at this time. After that period, we get the Crusades, and that's the Christian Crusades. So basically, if you're Jewish or Muslim, you're in trouble because it's all about being Christian. And so that wasn't really good for either one of those two groups at the time. Then finally, you get to the Mamluks, and the Mamluks were kind of slave Muslims. They were all soldier slave Muslims who decided we got enough power, we can take over. We're soldiers. So the Mamluks started to control things for a couple hundred years. And for the Jews, it was kind of an on and off. It wasn't really great. They were second-class citizens, but they were still allowed to do some kind of practice there. But it wasn't the ideal, people controlling that land. And then we get the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was huge. This is the Turkish Empire. This is the last great empire, really, before the World War. And so we look at the Ottoman Empire, a lot's happening there. So they defeat the Mamluks, and now they're in control of this area, quite a bit of area, actually, if you look. It's way more than just the land of Israel. But they rule over Palestine. They rebuild Jerusalem's wall with Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Napoleon tries to take over, and he doesn't. He attempts to conquer Jerusalem, but he gets defeated, and that doesn't happen. But we have a lot going on during this time, especially when you get to the 1800s and early 1900s. The first Jewish neighborhood, you get a lot of Jewish immigration into the land because, of course, after the World War, the Jews were like, we need to have a home. I mean, we're getting killed all over the place. We need to gather together and have a home. So Theodore Herzl chairs the first Zionist Congress, and we get a lot of immigration, and even Tel Aviv is officially established. So during the Ottoman Empire, Jews are second-class citizens. But what you'll know is in this land of Canaan, Israel, they really don't develop it. It's not developed. It's not like, oh, this is our holy land. I mean, they've got the mosque, but they don't develop this into a place where people live. And Mark Twain, as a lot of people have put this, Mark Twain even talks about this. So he's visiting them. So this is all the late 1800s. Mark Twain goes in 1867. He finally gets a boat ride to Jerusalem specifically. And this is what he says about Jerusalem during the end of the Ottoman Empire. Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. Of course, he's calling the whole land Palestine, but he's specifically talking about Jerusalem. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur. It's become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and glory of Israel, is gone. Palestine is desolate and unlovely. I remember first hearing this when Dad gave a speech a while ago, but even Mark Twain saying there's not much going on here. There's a few tribal people, but it's really not been developed. It's not been put into any kind of city state for a group of people. Then we get the World War and we get the British Mandate, the League of Nations. The Balfour Declaration says that we need to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. And then I've got a video that kind of goes through all this, but now we have a lot of fighting between the Arabs and the Jewish people to kind of take over this land because they're both living at the time. Finally, in 1948, we get the British Mandate ends and we have the State of Israel declared. But what I want to play is a couple videos that really goes through. Listen, originally, the not the Balfour Declaration, but the white papers, they provided a lot more land to the Palestinian Arabs than they did the Jews. But they continually refused that. So they were offered a state multiple times, but they refused that. And why they refused that, what we'll find is because they refused to let the Jews have a state or even recognize their existence. So I just want to play a couple short videos that kind of goes through the history better than I can do.
5 times in history, when Palestine rejected statehood, 1938, Peel Commission. After World War I, Britain controlled much of the Middle East, including what is now Israel. In 1936, Arabs revolted against both the British and the Jews. The Peel Commission investigated the rebellion. In 1937, the commission concluded Jews and Arabs both wanted to govern the same land. The solution was to establish 2 separate states. Arabs got the better end of the deal. They were offered 80% of the disputed territory. The Jews had to settle for the remaining 20%. Surprisingly, the Jews voted in favor of this offer. The Arabs declined the proposal. They opposed the concept of a Jewish state altogether. So they carried on with their rebellion. 1947, UN Partition Plan for Palestine. After a decade, the British turned to the UN for a solution. The UN, like the Peel Commission, chose to divide the land. In November 1947, the UN voted for 2 states. Jews accepted the offer. Arabs rejected it again. The Arabs responded with an all-out war. Multiple Arab nations joined the conflict. Israel emerged victorious and started nation building. The West Bank and East Jerusalem were meant for an Arab state, but they became occupied by Jordan, not Israel. 1967, Six-Day War. 20 years later, Arab nations led by Egypt attempted to destroy Israel. This conflict was called the Six-Day War. Israel won a remarkable victory. Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza came under Israeli control. The government was divided on the land's fate. Some wanted to return it to Jordan and Egypt for peace. Others suggested giving it to local Arabs. Neither option made much progress. A few months later, the Arab League met in Sudan. They declared the infamous 3 no's. 1. No peace with Israel. 2. No recognition of Israel. 3. No negotiations with Israel. 4. Once more, the Arabs rejected a 2-state solution. 2000, Camp David Summit. In 2000, Israeli PM Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat met at Camp David. Barak proposed a 2-state plan. Initially, the offer defined a Palestinian state on 73% of the West Bank. It also included 100% of the Gaza Strip. Over time, the Palestinian state would expand to a maximum of 92% of the West Bank. The Gaza Strip would be separate from the West Bank. East Jerusalem would be the capital of Palestine. The negotiators were closer than ever to reaching an agreement, but Arafat ultimately rejected the offer. As U.S. President Bill Clinton put it, Arafat was here 14 days and said no to everything. 2008, final peace offer. In 2008, Israel made another attempt. Ehud Olmert went further than Ehud Barak. He offered to give up the Temple Mount. He proposed a committee to oversee the religious sites in Jerusalem. The committee would be represented by 5 nations: Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Palestine, the U.S., and Israel. Mahmoud Abbas, like his predecessor, said no. Olmert clarified why Abbas didn't return to talks. The Palestinians considered the end of George W. Bush's term. They hoped for a more favorable leader in Washington. They also believed Olmert's political career was over.
So I think that's just kind of interesting when people talk about, and I think this is the curse, on God's people. It's frustrating to watch, but of course, this is the way it's supposed to be. But another thing I would say is we look at the lines between when they were established as a country in 1948, and this map's 1949, and then the 1967 war. I mean, we're almost 20 years here. And on the map to the left, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, and Gaza was controlled by Egypt. So if the Palestinian Arabs wanted their own state, they were controlled and ruled by Arab nations. But there was never any talk of we need our own state, our own Palestinian state, until after the 1967 war, where Israel suddenly takes over this because they were attacked on all sides. Now, suddenly, the land that Israel fought back needs to be a Palestinian state. But I would always argue to people that are talking about this, they had almost 20 years when they were Muslim majority controlled. Why didn't they give them the state at that point when they controlled the land? And then finally, we got 2005. That's the last thing I want to talk about with this is in 2005. It's another short video when they decided, okay, listen, if you want to be a state, we'll give you land, we'll give you territory. You need to set up all the recommendations from UN as far as a secure border, political system, and then you might qualify as a state. And so one more, it's like a 3-minute video, 2 minutes.
In June 2004, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced plans to unilaterally disengage from Gaza. Gaza was territory that Israel had won during the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel had hoped that withdrawing from Gaza would be an important step toward peace with the Palestinians. In 2005, Israel left Gaza, uprooting 1,700 families and 21 Jewish communities. Schools and synagogues were closed, and graves and military bases relocated. Greenhouses and other structures from previously Israeli communities were left behind for Palestinians' use and benefit. Yet upon Israel's withdrawal, Palestinians instead entered these previously Israeli-owned buildings and destroyed them, along with several synagogues. Following Israel's withdrawal, the Palestinian Authority failed to transition smoothly into full control of Gaza. This leadership vacuum led to the terrorist group Hamas's rise to power. To this day, Hamas diverts humanitarian resources away from the people in Gaza to buy weapons and dig tunnels for their war against Israel. Since 2005, more than 15,000 rockets have been fired into Israel by Gaza-based terrorist groups.
So the conclusion is this is all God's plan, and this is some of the prophecy taking place. I find it frustrating, but I know this is probably what I should be taking joy in and rejoicing in because I know this is what it's supposed to be like at the end times. But nonetheless, if somebody's still saying free Palestine, I want to have some kind of knowledge because if they're going to blow the Bible off, then I still want to have some historical, archaeological comeback just to say, listen, this doesn't make sense what you're saying. Your religion didn't even start until 800s, like thousands of years after we have tons of evidence of these people being there. So in conclusion, the land of Israel has been occupied by kind of starting at the beginning, the Canaanites, the Israelites, Persians, Hellenistics, kind of the Greek people, the Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans, British, and finally since 1948, the state of Israel. Uh, the use of the word Palestine to describe the entire land really became popularized and used almost everywhere after Hadrian in the Roman Empire at 135. There's never officially been a Palestinian state of the land. 2005 is when they wanted peace and gave them the opportunity through the UN to have that. Um, we would argue that between 48 and 67, those lands were Arab controlled. They could have easily made their own state with them if they wanted to do that, if that's truly a goal that they had. There's always been Jews living in the land, but the most important part, the land has been promised to the seed of Abraham. So whether we look at that as his literal seed, which I think I agree with that too, but more importantly, if you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise for the future, the reestablishment of David's throne in the kingdom, which will be in that same area.